I'm a speedrun chapters 15 and 16 and what I learned from those. Chapter 15 was all about organizations and cultures, culture being the pattern of shared norms, rules, values, and beliefs that guide the attitudes and behaviors of employees. It talked about the components of culture being organizational and observational and non-observational, and then it talked about the competing values framework. That included the two dimensions being flexibility and discretion versus stability and control, and then the second one being internal focus versus external focus. It talked about clan culture versus hierarchy culture versus market culture versus adnocracy, something like that. I don't know how to say it. It talked about dominant cultures, subcultures, and countercultures, the differences between those, which is most important, why the other ones are not important. It talked about strong versus weak culture, and then artifacts and functions. It talked about the two main functions of organizational structure being the external adaptation and internal integration. It talked about potential dysfunctions of cultures being change hindrance, diversity hindrance, and then merger and acquisition hindrance. Merger and acquisition hindrance meaning like two would have a hard time getting together. I talked about the types of organizational, including positive organizational culture, communal culture, fragmented, mercenary, networked, ethical, and spiritual. And then I talked about Hofstede's dimensions, including power distance, individualistic, collectivist, uncertainty avoidance, and then it talked about standardization versus localization. It talks about extradites versus high potential employees and how those can both have culture shocks. It talked about the 5 stages of culture, adaptation being the honeymoon, disintegration, reintegration, autonomy, and then independence. It talked about selection practices and socialization methods, and then it talked about why expedites can fail, but also then the benefits and the cost of working foreign projects like that. It talked about the Fieldman's model of organizational socialization, including anticipatory socialization, the encounter phase, and then the change and acquisition phase. And then we get into chapter 16, which is organization, change, and structure. I talked about change management, which was the method of overseeing and implementing change to support the transformation of organizational goals, processes, and technologies. It talked about the change process and everything, including that. It talked about the Dada syndrome, which included the denial, anger, depression, and acceptance. It talked about Lewin's basic change model, which included unfreezing, the most difficult stage, and then transformation and refreezing. It talked about the forces for change, including external and internal forces, and then different things within the external and internal. It talked about the organizational sources for resistance to change and gave a big laundry list of that, both internally and the organizational sources for resistance to change. It gave you reasons for reducing the resistance to change, and then it talked about Kotter's 8-step change model to try and also reduce that resistance to change, and then it got into organizational structure being the framework of roles and functions that helps shape and support employee behavior. And then it talked about specialization, also known as divisions of labor. It talked about departmentalization, and then the chain of command and the unity of command within that chain of command. Then it also talked about span of control and how you can have a centralized versus decentralized, including in the terms of decision making. It talked about the mechanicalistic model versus the organic model and how those two differ. And then it talked about the difference in between formalization and bureaucracy. It gave the 4 types of organizational structure and broke each of those down, had really cool diagrams that helped break them down. It was the simple, functional, divisional, also known as multi-divisional, and then the matrix. And then it talked about functional managers within that matrix and project managers within that matrix. And then it talked about organizational develop, the 5 types of organizational developmental change interventions. Those 5 being structural, task technology, socio-technical systems, quality of work, life interventions, and people-focused interventions.